My name is Rachel Morvan. I'm 33, co-founder of a small creative agency in Asheville, North Carolina. And on the evening of my father's retirement party, I was erased in front of a room full of people trained to notice everything and pretend they hadn't. The celebration took place at a private rooftop venue in Midtown Manhattan. Walnut floors, smoked glass windows, and a guest list curated like a mergers and acquisitions deal. My father, Charles Morvan, had spent 4 decades as managing partner of a litigation firm that had defended pharmaceutical giants and energy conglomerates with equal finesse. He was stepping down with all the spectacle such careers demand: crystal stemware, a jazz quartet, and a curated video montage featuring black and white headshots of him from the 80s. It was a shrine built from billable hours. I stood near the far wall, flanked by floral arrangements taller than most guests, invisible and unbothered by it. I had attended out of some sense of obligation I couldn't explain, an old reflex. I knew how these rooms worked: where to stand, how long to smile, what to say without being heard. I wore navy, respectable understated, and my shoes were a compromise between elegance and escape. I didn't expect a tribute. I didn't even expect eye contact. What I didn't expect was to become a pivot in the evening. I own a branding studio. We design visual identities and outreach strategy for community legal clinics, small-scale environmental groups, refugee literacy programs. Our office is the top floor of a converted craftsman house. My desk is usually covered in Pantone swatches, scribbled timelines, and old coffee cups. It's not glamorous, it's not corporate, but it's mine. Eli, my husband, is the co-founder. We met at a design sprint in Durham. His mock-ups were clean, his questions sharper. We started Halcyon not to disrupt anything, but to build something intact from the beginning. Over the years, we helped reframe stories that never got told properly. We stayed late, we paid ourselves last, we kept the lights on. None of that mattered in that room. I remember the silence more than the sound, the shift in attention, the discomfort cloaked in courtesy. My father's final words landed in a room grown suddenly too formal, too curated for dissent. I stood because I had to. The shape of the moment required it. My hands were steady, but only just. I could feel the scrutiny, not as hostility, but as indifference wrapped in etiquette. When Eli stood beside me, it wasn't for effect. He didn't reach for my hand or whisper comfort. He just stood, as if to say that whatever came next would be born in tandem. There was no scene, just movement, just consequence. Afterward, people asked what I had done. I never answered. Some stories don't survive dissection. Some silences are more honest than any clarification. I grew up in Ridgefield, a quiet town with old brick sidewalks, post-war colonials, and lawns that were professionally edged. The kind of place where no one locked their doors, but every mailbox was polished. Our house was the biggest on the street, a slate blue Georgian with white columns and windows that always looked closed, even when they weren't. Outsiders called it classic. Insiders knew it was curated. My father's office was the only room in the house we weren't allowed to enter without permission. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, dark green leather chairs, framed degrees from Yale and Harvard, and a scent of aged paper and cologne that never quite left your clothes. The door was rarely shut, but it was always closed. That distinction mattered. My mother, Evelyn, floated quietly between rooms, her presence like ambient light, warm but indirect. She hosted fundraisers, art auctions, and occasionally small dinners for partners' wives. Her hands always moved, folding napkins, refilling crystal, adjusting sleeve hems. She never interrupted, not once, even when the shouting started behind my father's office door, especially then. When I was 9, I won a regional art contest for a charcoal drawing of a bridge during a thunderstorm. The judges called it emotionally stark and sent a certificate with embossed gold lettering. I taped it to my bedroom wall. It lasted 3 days before disappearing. My father said tape left residue, and awards were for things with future value. That same week, Lucas was featured in the local paper for winning his first mock trial. Nora made the honor roll at prep school again. No one asked about the bridge or the storm. Over time, I adjusted. I learned that silence preserved peace. That nuance had no place in expectations. That recognition, if not earned through accepted metrics, was irrelevant. My report cards became strategic. My hobbies, edited. My laughter, measured. I studied communications at a mid-tier state college, my own choice, my own tuition. My father called it a lateral move into mediocrity. He stopped offering opinions shortly after, just a nod or nothing. I supported myself with freelance copywriting gigs, editing blog posts for solar startups and women's wellness brands. When I met Eli at a design sprint workshop in Durham, he was the only person who read my landing page wireframe and asked about the community it was targeting, not just the clicks it would convert. We talked about frictionless interfaces and broken narratives over tea in a courtyard filled with mismatched furniture. By the end of the week, we'd storyboarded the idea for Halcyon on the back of a napkin. Neither of us mentioned it was the first time we'd been excited in months. We moved into a 2-bedroom rental with uneven hardwood floors and ceiling fans that groaned when used above medium. Eli built our desks from reclaimed wood. I collected typefaces like people collect playlists. We survived on grit and short-term contracts. Some months were lean, others were lighter. The work felt necessary, sometimes even beautiful. I didn't tell my father about Halcyon. Not at first. Not until we landed our first long-term project, a branding overhaul for a small network of pro bono immigration clinics. When I finally emailed him, the response came 5 days later. One line, "Let me know when it scales." 2 years passed. We launched campaigns that reached thousands of underserved families. We built frameworks for trauma-informed design. We trained interns who came from the very communities our clients served. We published a visual toolkit that went quietly viral among nonprofit communications officers. We paid off our business loan ahead of schedule. But my father never asked a single question. He didn't attend our wedding. Neither did Lucas. Nora showed up alone, leaving before dessert. I told myself it didn't matter, that weddings were ceremonial, not relational. But I kept the RSVP envelope anyway, folded neatly into my journal. Eli never mentioned it. My relationship with my family thinned into holiday emails and forwarded legal briefs. I stayed on the periphery, visible but untethered. And then came the invitation. Thick paper, engraved, a rooftop gala for Charles Morvan. 40 years of service, one final tribute. I stared at the RSVP card for hours before checking accepts. Eli circled the date on the calendar without a word. The week leading up to the event felt like standing at the edge of a field, waiting for thunder. I updated our portfolio, bought a new blazer, edited and re-edited my LinkedIn summary. I wasn't preparing for the party. I was preparing to be witnessed, not celebrated, just seen. The night of the gala, I looked like someone I barely recognized. Hair set, dress pressed, eyes lined just enough to look intentional. I'd practiced what I might say if given the opportunity. Phrases like public impact metrics, story-based strategy, and human-centered engagement. Words I hoped would translate in a room built on litigation and legacy. But there were no introductions, no invitation to speak. Just assigned seating near the fire exit, sandwiched between my great-aunt's second husband and a retired paralegal from the Trenton office. I watched as Lucas posed for photos beside a digital backdrop of the firm's new skyscraper headquarters. Nora chatted with a board member from a hospital I couldn't afford to visit out of network. A few people nodded politely in my direction, unsure of my identity. One woman asked if I was Nora's assistant. I smiled and sipped sparkling water, avoiding the champagne. Eli's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, grounding me. When my father took the stage, his voice carried across the terrace like it had in every courtroom for 40 years, measured, calm, indisputable. He thanked the founders, the partners, the clients, the janitor who'd been there since the building opened. He told stories about precedent-setting cases and firm mergers that outlasted recessions. He referenced Lucas's early career with pride, Nora's contributions to legal medical ethics with admiration. Then he paused, looked out across the crowd. There was a long silence, a knowing one. That's when it shifted. That's when it began. And none of us, not even Eli, knew where it would land. The morning after the gala felt unnaturally still, like the hours after a storm when nothing has yet been named as damage. The apartment was quiet, the air brittle with the scent of unopened emails and questions I wasn't ready to answer. I moved slowly, deliberately, folding laundry, organizing receipts, deleting photos from my phone without looking too closely. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I went for a walk around the neighborhood and came back with nothing but a slight ache in my jaw. the kind that comes from holding yourself in place too tightly for too long. The messages began around noon. A mix of hesitant inquiries and disjointed apologies from distant relatives, interspersed with the kind of vague statements people make when they don't know where they stand. I answered none of them. I archived what I could, skimmed the rest, and added no names to my contact list. By evening, the subject lines had started to shift, from confusion to correction, from misinterpretation to management. I read each one once. Then I shut the laptop. Eli didn't push. He made dinner, watered the herbs on the balcony, responded to our team's Slack messages with quiet efficiency. I watched him from the hallway, his shoulders curved slightly inward, his voice calm. I couldn't tell whether he was giving me space or holding something back for himself. Maybe both. By the second day, I returned to work. We had a pitch due for a grassroots criminal justice reform coalition, a project we'd been courting for weeks. I reviewed the discovery notes, adjusted the positioning language, and rewrote the tone guidelines from scratch. Eli said nothing, but he watched me more carefully than usual. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was structured, intentional. We moved inside it like people navigating a newly drawn blueprint. I began cataloging our client archive late at night, a quiet review of everything we had built in the past 3 years: neighborhood food co-ops, domestic violence shelters, after-school literacy programs. I compiled data, impact quotes, select visuals. I organized them into folders, each titled with a single word: access, voice, trust. I wasn't sure what I was making. I just knew I wanted it somewhere. Ready. The third night, I received a text from Nora. Short, defensive, familiar. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. Instead, I opened an old external hard drive, one I hadn't touched since our first office space, and started scanning archived campaign visuals, old sketches, client mood boards, even drafts of a case study I never published. Something about the act felt necessary, like inventory or evidence. By the end of the week, I had stopped thinking about whether I had done something wrong and started thinking about whether I had done enough. The narrative had already been set by others, written in a room where I hadn't been invited to speak. My name had become a placeholder. My absence had been formalized. But absence, I was learning, could be used. On the surface, nothing changed. I showed up to team meetings. I delivered client updates. I edited proofs and signed off on print orders. I replied to emails within 4 hours. I was precise, timely, unremarkable. Even my therapist seemed unsure how to interpret the tone I brought to our next session: flat, clear, unfinished. I told her I was fine. She watched me a moment longer than necessary before writing something down. There was a letter from my father waiting in the mail the following Tuesday. Handwritten, thick cardstock, postmarked from the firm's private address. The envelope smelled faintly of cedar. I opened it in the kitchen, standing barefoot on cold tile. The contents were as expected: composed, impersonal, and constructed to sound reflective without acknowledging specifics. I read it once. I placed it in a drawer. I didn't mention it to Eli. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with a former client, an advocate at a housing rights nonprofit who now worked with a civic engagement initiative in Boston. I framed the request as a casual catch-up. We met over video. I asked about their latest campaign. I offered feedback on a draft visual. I asked a few questions that didn't sound as strategic as they were. Afterward, I made a list. Not a to-do list. Not yet. Just a document with bullet points, names, dates, phrases, no verbs, no conclusions. Later that evening, I reorganized my bookshelf, took down a row of old branding books and replaced them with field research volumes and case studies in narrative justice. I didn't know who would see the shelf, but I wanted it to say something without speaking. The next morning, I requested transcripts from 3 public speaking engagements my father had given over the past decade. All legal conferences, all available through the firm's PR site. I downloaded them. I highlighted nothing. I just read, slowly. There were patterns. That weekend, I accepted a coffee invitation from an old colleague of his, a woman I hadn't seen in over a decade, but remembered from childhood events and holiday cards. We met in a quiet cafe on the Upper East Side, away from the noise. We talked about the weather. We talked about urban policy. We did not talk about the gala, but something in her eyes shifted when she realized I wasn't there to vent. I paid the bill. On the train ride home, I revised the folder titles on my desktop, renamed one, moved another. I didn't tell anyone. At the studio, I approved a reprint for one of our clients' billboards. It featured a single sentence in bold type against a stark background. When Eli saw it, he raised an eyebrow. He didn't ask, but he looked longer than usual. That night, I slept without interruption for the first time in weeks. In the morning, I answered a message from a journalist I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who'd once covered local government scandals and now freelanced feature profiles on public figures. I said I wasn't available for an interview, but I did suggest a few questions that might be worth exploring. I included no context, only links. That evening, I bought a new black dress, not for mourning, not for protest, just something appropriate, for whatever might be next. Eli watched me zip the garment bag and place it in the closet. He didn't ask why. I didn't offer. We ate dinner quietly. He brought out an old bottle of wine we'd been saving for no particular reason. I poured it into 2 glasses. We drank without toasts. Afterward, I opened my laptop. I began writing. Not to publish, not yet. But some stories have to be ready before anyone asks for them. It began without ceremony. No announcement, no signal. Just the soft echo of a glass tapped with a ring finger, breaking the rhythm of clinking cutlery and curated background jazz. I stood again in a room I was meant to disappear from, but this time I didn't move toward the door. I didn't flinch. I didn't falter. I remained still, an axis, as everything around me began to tilt. Eli was the one who moved first. He rose slowly, measured, not defiant, not theatrical. There was something disarming in the lack of tension in his posture, as if what he was about to do had already been decided long ago, and he was simply carrying out the logistics. Around us, chairs creaked, conversations stalled. The din of the party quieted into that peculiar kind of hush that occurs only in spaces where discomfort is too new to be named. A few faces turned out of curiosity, then confusion, then certainty. They realized what was happening moments before it actually did. When Eli addressed the room, there was no tremor in his voice. His words weren't sharp, but they were sharp-edged. He didn't raise his voice, but people leaned forward. They stopped chewing. They stopped sipping. Some of them forgot what expression they'd been wearing. The only sound for a time was the rustling of linen and the subtle shift of weight in tailored suits. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. There are kinds of truths that carry weight, not because of their volume, but because of how long they've been withheld. Each sentence that left his mouth settled like sediment in a clear glass, visible, undeniable. The narrative began to fracture. Small cracks at first, a widened eye, a fork dropped against a plate. A murmur passed between guests who had long ago aligned themselves with one version of the family story, now forced to reconcile what they'd never asked. Lucas looked stunned, not in protest, but in some internal reckoning. He didn't interrupt. His hand, resting on the back of the chair, tightened slightly, then loosened. His gaze fixed on the centerpiece in front of him, as if it might offer a counter-argument. Nora remained still, her features unreadable, her expression so carefully composed that it betrayed its own effort. The napkin in her lap had been folded in half twice, then unfolded once. My father didn't react immediately. He waited. He always waited. It had been his strategy in courtrooms and family rooms alike. But this time, the silence that followed was not his to control. It spread without instruction, and by the time he spoke, the room had already begun listening to someone else. There was no shouting, no scandalous outburst, just a subtle unraveling of posture, a shift in power not declared but witnessed. People who had known him for decades now saw him not just as a man retiring from power, but as a man revealed in its absence. An older partner from his firm coughed awkwardly and excused himself to take a call. Another guest stared at her glass with a kind of frozen concentration. Someone laughed once, too loudly, then immediately stopped. A woman seated 2 tables behind us reached for her clutch with practiced poise, but didn't stand. No one made eye contact unless they were certain they wouldn't flinch. I remained still, not out of shock, not even restraint, just awareness. I was not waiting for validation. I wasn't there to be redeemed. Eli sat back down. The gesture was almost invisible, but the shift it caused was seismic. In the minutes that followed, people returned to their meals in the way one returns to a book after a fire alarm, distracted, unsure, fumbling for composure. The servers resumed their rounds with professional detachment, offering silent acknowledgement that the evening had in some way transformed. When dessert was served, I didn't touch mine. The chocolate souffle was beautifully constructed, its shell still warm, the center just beginning to soften. I stared at it as though it belonged to another version of the evening. Around us, small conversations resumed, but now there were pauses between phrases, double meanings in questions that used to be small talk. Someone asked Eli about his work, his voice higher than usual. Another guest suddenly remembered an early flight and began offering premature farewells. When we stood to leave, no one stopped us. My father didn't speak again. At the exit, a woman I barely knew, someone I remembered only as a recurring figure in annual family newsletters, placed her hand briefly on my arm. It wasn't an apology, not a gesture of allegiance either, just acknowledgement. Her eyes flickered with something between regret and recognition, but she said nothing. It was enough. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint scent of April rain before it arrived. Eli hailed a car. I watched the restaurant fade behind us in the reflection of the window. Inside, the lights still glowed with expensive warmth, but something beneath them had shifted permanently. The drive home was quiet. Neither of us filled the silence. We didn't need to. In the days that followed, the messages began again, but they were different this time. Fewer disclaimers, more hesitations, a handful of invitations to catch up without context. Lucas sent a brief message that said little but not nothing. Nora sent none. The letter from my father arrived a week later, typed, signed, unsentimental, a continuation of the same posture. I placed it in the same drawer as the first one. I went back to work, finalized deliverables, responded to clients, delivered a virtual talk on narrative design in community campaigns. No one mentioned the gala, but attendance was higher than usual, and the comments section moved faster than I'd seen before. At the end of that month, we were approached by a foundation interested in funding a new initiative. The contact mentioned hearing about us through an unexpected channel. They asked for a portfolio. I sent them the folder marked Voice. Eli never referenced the gala again. He didn't need to. He began adding new names to our weekly sync notes, advisors, consultants, legal experts. I didn't ask why. I just made space on the calendar. We moved the framed certificate from our first grant to the wall behind my desk. We ordered a new sign for the front of our building. I didn't tell anyone what would come next. They would know. In time. Spring moved slowly that year, arriving in increments, first through the thinning frost on our windows, then through the scent of wet soil after late rain, and finally through the return of light in the early mornings. The days after the gala unfolded with a kind of quiet certainty, not triumphant, but steady, like a room gradually coming back into focus after a long night. Work resumed its familiar rhythm. There were emails to return, a grant proposal to revise, deadlines to meet. Clients never asked about the event. Most didn't know. A few might have heard, but said nothing. Still, their tone changed. Meetings that once felt transactional now leaned into curiosity. People lingered longer on calls. They asked broader questions. They began speaking about their missions in terms that felt closer to narrative, not just numbers. 2 weeks after the gala, I was invited to contribute to a panel discussion on ethical storytelling for grassroots movements. The request came from an organizer who had once turned down our proposal, citing lack of experience with scale-driven campaigns. Now, she referenced our clarity of voice and uncompromised framing. I accepted, not for visibility, but because I wanted to test whether my voice still held steady in public. The panel was virtual, low production, hosted on a modest platform, but the chat filled quickly. Attendees asked thoughtful questions, many of them framed around trust, equity, and narrative transparency. Afterward, one of the moderators reached out privately to ask for a list of resources. I sent them a folder labeled Structure, no commentary needed. Shortly after, a regional nonprofit that focused on re-entry programs for formerly incarcerated women reached out with a collaboration inquiry. They had been referred by a former client of ours, a shelter we had helped rebrand in our second year. I remembered that project clearly, not because it was high profile, but because it had felt human in ways that most campaigns don't. The referral included a single sentence: they listen before they design. That was all. Recognition, when it came, was quiet. a tagged mention in a thread about mission-led branding, a footnote in a funding report citing our language framework, a last-minute invitation to join a working group drafting ethical guidelines for community-centered media. These weren't headlines. They were the foundations of something more durable. At home, things shifted too. Our routines deepened. We made time for walks without talking about work. Eli repaired an old film camera he'd found in a secondhand shop. I began writing again, not for publication but to document notes, observations, sentences that held shape without agenda. Some nights we sat on the balcony and let the city speak around us. One afternoon, I received an email from a program director at a foundation we had once pitched unsuccessfully. She referenced the gala only obliquely, heard you navigated a rather public moment with composure, before inviting me to consult on a new mentorship fund for emerging creatives. The tone wasn't flattering. It was respectful. There was a difference. Around that time, Lucas called. The conversation was tentative, like opening a long-closed drawer without knowing what might be inside. He didn't mention the gala directly. He asked about our latest projects, about how we were managing operations with such a lean team. I answered plainly, without performance. Before we hung up, he paused longer than necessary. I didn't fill the silence. Some gaps are meant to remain open, if only for what they allow to pass through later. There were invitations, too. Some subtle, some overt. A conference on nonprofit storytelling, a leadership circle for founders of mission-led businesses, a small fellowship for narrative design and civic policy. I accepted a few, declined others. Not everything required my presence. My father never responded to the silence that followed the letter. Not through a phone call, not through another note. His absence settled in like architecture, fixed, structured, no longer startling. Occasionally, I would hear his name mentioned in professional circles, usually in connection with legacy cases or firm history. There was nothing more to say. Meanwhile, our work expanded. We hired 2 part-time contractors, both women from organizations we had previously served, now transitioning into creative careers. We moved into a larger office, just 1 floor above our old one. Eli painted the walls soft gray. I installed a row of framed client stories across the entryway. Not logos, just quotes. Impact, written in someone else's words. Our agency's name started appearing on resource lists we hadn't submitted to. Blog posts, forums, grant directories. Clients began referencing our work without needing backstory. People showed up already understanding our approach. There was no longer a need to explain why we led with narrative. In late summer, we launched a pilot mentorship series for first-generation creatives building careers in values-based branding. We funded it quietly through surplus from a long-term contract. No sponsorships, no press. The application form asked only one question: what story do you wish someone had told you when you started? The responses filled me with a kind of weightless certainty, stories of silence, of survival, of erasure, of resilience. We selected 5 mentees. Their first session began with a single slide that read, "You are not a correction, you are the point." At the end of the year, our agency was nominated for a Community Impact Award. We didn't win. We didn't expect to. But when our name was read aloud during the ceremony, I noticed something subtle. The applause didn't dip. It held. It sustained. That was enough. In December, we published a short internal report titled Narratives That Stay. It wasn't a marketing piece. It wasn't glossy. Just a synthesis of what we'd learned in the past 3 years. What worked, what didn't, what questions remained. We made it publicly available. No sign-up required. A week later, a design student from Michigan messaged me. She said she'd read the report and felt less alone in her doubts. She asked if she could intern with us next summer. I replied yes. Sometimes, movement doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it settles quietly into the shape of your days, until one morning you realize the center has shifted. Not by force, not by fight, but by standing still long enough for the noise to pass and for the truth to remain. By the following spring, the sharp edges of what had happened the year before had worn into something quieter, no longer raw, but not forgotten. The memory of that night no longer pulsed behind every email, every meeting, every unguarded moment. It existed now like a stone smoothed by water, something I could turn over in my hand and examine without flinching. The agency had grown in quiet increments. Not fast enough to raise eyebrows, not flashy enough to attract unnecessary attention. But it was steady, reliable, the kind of growth that builds outward from a foundation, not upward toward a spotlight. We had published our first open source toolkit, begun a quarterly community lab, and taken on a series of long-term projects that aligned exactly with what we had set out to do. In early March, I was invited to speak at a symposium on ethical design hosted at my alma mater. The email came from a professor I barely remembered, someone who had once dismissed my capstone project as thoughtful but commercially impractical. She wrote now with warmth, professionalism, and what I sensed was quiet curiosity. The theme of the symposium was Design for Social Integrity. They asked if I would consider opening the final day. I accepted, not because I had something to prove, but because I no longer needed to. The campus had changed little. The same oak trees lining the walkways, the same glass atrium where students gathered with coffees and open laptops, the same faint echo of conversation in the library stairwell. I stood behind the podium in a room I had once walked through without being noticed, and for a moment, simply breathed. The presentation was not rehearsed in the usual sense. I didn't speak in bullet points. I didn't walk through our wins. I spoke about frameworks, about accountability, about how stories could be tools or weapons, depending on who held them. I mentioned our agency only briefly, not as a brand, but as a case. I used the word we more than I, not out of modesty, but because it was the truth. The audience was quiet in that way that means they are following, not waiting to respond. No one looked at their phone. No one left early. A few people took notes. One student in the front row kept her hand on her chest like she needed to feel the rhythm of the moment. When the applause came, it wasn't loud, but it was whole. Afterward, a man in a charcoal sweater approached me with a worn copy of our Narratives That Stay report in his hands. He was a lecturer from a nearby state college. He said he'd been using our work in his classroom. He asked if I would ever consider writing a book. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I told him the report had started as a document for our interns, that most of the lessons in it were learned the hard way, that its value, if any, came not from authority but from application. He nodded. Then he said something simple, that the work felt lived in. Back at the hotel that evening, I opened my laptop and found a message waiting. It was from a woman who had attended the symposium remotely. She was a mid-career professional transitioning into nonprofit communications after nearly 2 decades in corporate branding. She didn't ask for advice. She just said that the talk made her feel less like she had to choose between impact and integrity. I read her message twice. Then I replied, not with a solution, just with permission. A few weeks later, our agency was profiled in a national publication focused on mission-led innovation. The article was modest, 2 pages, no cover, tucked between pieces about civic tech and social finance. But it was thoughtful, well-researched. The journalist had spoken with former clients, read through our archives, even referenced a campaign we had quietly sunsetted the year before. The headline didn't use words like hero or disruptor. It simply read, work that remembers who it's for. Someone sent the piece to my father. I don't know who. A cousin, maybe. An old colleague. I never asked. Weeks passed without response. Then one morning, a slim envelope appeared in our mail, my name written in the distinct, precise handwriting I had memorized long ago. Inside was a clipping of the article, folded once. No note, no return address, no markings. I placed it in the back of a drawer, next to the first letter he had sent and never followed up on. It didn't hurt to see his handwriting. It didn't soothe anything either. It just existed, like he did, like the past did. Later that month, I was asked to write a closing reflection for a leadership journal. The theme was reframing failure. I wrote about proximity, about how sometimes the things we are closest to distort our sense of scale, about how distance allows meaning to emerge not as vindication, but as clarity. I ended the piece with a sentence I didn't revise. Some endings are simply places we chose not to return to. On a warm afternoon in late May, we hosted an open studio for our community partners. Nothing formal, no agenda, just food, conversation, and space. At one point, a former client approached me by the coffee station. She had recently transitioned from her role at a shelter to leading a statewide network of mutual aid projects. She said she still used our old campaign language, still pulled it out during staff training. Then she said something else, something I hadn't heard directly before. She said the work we'd done had made her feel seen, not celebrated, not saved, just visible. That stayed with me. As the guests trickled out and the lights dimmed, I found myself alone in the office for a few moments. I looked around, at the shelves lined with marked up proofs and framed community feedback, at the chalkboard still bearing sketches from the last brainstorm, at the door that bore no title, only a brass handle slightly dulled by use. There was nothing more I needed to say, nothing more to prove. Some stories resolve not with declarations, but with arrival. And sometimes, the most enduring kind of justice is simply being exactly where you belong. Sometimes, the victories that matter most don't look like a spotlight or a standing ovation. They sound like your name spoken without hesitation. They feel like being invited, not because someone has to, but because they finally see the shape of who you are. This story isn't about revenge or even redemption. It's about what happens when someone stops trying to earn a seat at the wrong table and begins building something steadier elsewhere, a kind of justice that doesn't scream. It arrives quietly through the choices you make every day to stay aligned with yourself. It can take years for recognition to catch up with truth, and sometimes it never fully does. But that doesn't make your work less real. That doesn't make your presence less worthy. If you've ever been overlooked, doubted, or told that your version of success doesn't count, know this: value is not always measured by applause. Sometimes it's measured by the silence you no longer fill with apology. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves behind. What would you build if you stopped asking for permission? Thank you for listening.